Tadami dama the lupo the kulati Miro kadama the kori kadalayi Ami pudya the rore kalamali Gami sumchut the hit gonna chalati Tadami dama the lupo the kulati Miro kadama the kori kadalayi Ami pudya the rore kalamali Gami sumchut the hit gonna chalati
참로 등록이 부정하다 바둑하울라 잘 주시고 싶다. 벽이 룽딩기 인지 게나 레림 당부 당부 차고 엔디 센시낭 상물라 참리다 다시들레슈 다시들렉 welcome to the first edition of Tibet Radio's conversation in English. My name is BHUCHUNG D. SONAM. I am a Tibetan writer, translator, and publisher at Black Neck Books. Black Neck Books is an imprint of Tibet Rights. It's a small independent publisher based in Dharamshala. What is art? What is resistance? In communities such as ours and Uyghur and Hong Kong and even China, these two terms are deeply intertwined. You know, how can artists tell stories in a way that can determine what we want and to assert our basic freedom and dignity? So to talk about all of these and hopefully many more things, I am honored and privileged to have this conversation with Badiucao. Welcome to Dharamshala, and thank you very much indeed for taking part in this event.
Thank you. This is my honor.
And we have a small but eclectic audience, including journalists, writers, and filmmakers, and activists. And I hope that we are going to have a lot of questions from them as well. So to begin with, I wanted to ask you about your name, Badiucao. How did you end up choosing this name, and what does it mean?
Well, actually, Badiucao is a direct result of me trying to be anonymous from the very beginning of my dissident art practice. Well, you know, in China, that there's no freedom of speech, there's no freedom of expression. Any artist dare to speak up against this regime will be punished severely. So when I started making little doodling about China's politics and human rights, that I know that I need to find a way to protect myself. So I have to be anonymous. I have to be hidden. And in order to achieve that, I think, you know, certainly I cannot use my real name. Also, that I need to find a name is actually have zero attachment to my real identity. And I was thinking, what about I just imitating Dadaism by, you know, randomly choosing 3 words from the book, then compose it as my name. So really, Badiucao doesn't really have any existing meaning behind it. But I guess now Badiucao does fulfill some of the meaning through the practice of my art.
Mm-hmm. So at least my name is slightly better than yours.
Yeah, absolutely.
My name Puchung means small boy.
Aha.
But some of the Tibetan names like Shenyan or Tenzin Chuge or Gelson Jigme, they have deep and vast meaning. So at least they are, you know, in a higher state than we to us here. So the other question that I wanted to ask is, you grew up in Shanghai.
Yes.
And you studied law and political science. Then you moved to Australia, where you became a teacher for quite some time. So how did this long jump from being an aspiring law student to being a teacher to an artist happen?
I think my early time that growing up in China, like many other Chinese kids, that our trajectory is very much decided by our parents. And for my parents, they want to make sure that I do 2 right things. The first thing is steering away from art. Why is that? Because I was actually born in an artistic family that my grandpa and his brother were filmmakers in China in the 1930, 40 until 1950. After the Chinese Communist Party is in power, that they got persecuted in 57's anti-intellectual movement or anti-right-wing movement called 100 Blossom. So my parents never want me to repeat this tragedy. Thus, they tell me those family stories to warning me to steering away from on the path of doing anything about culture, literature, or art, because that's how they believe it would be dangerous. Then, like every parents want you to have a good job, have good earning. So, being a lawyer is even though, it's kind of a joke for rule of law in China, but still being a lawyer can be very lucrative in such environment. So that kind of setting me to study in a law school in China. But for me, this is never really what I want. For me, I like the story from my great parents when they're movie stars, filmmakers, being creative. So I made this decision that I have to leave China so that I will not put myself in danger. Apparently, this is a bit naive if we see it from now. But by the time I think, if I move to a Western country, maybe I'll be okay and I can make art like my great parents. So, but in order to achieve that, I have to have the green card, also called the permanent visa. And Australia was a country that I choose. As for Australia and many other immigrations' dream, that you simply do not just start your life that easy. There's a detour you have to go. And to immigrant to those countries that you have to study or work, the position, the occupation, or this work that the local do not want to do. And to be a teacher is something that Australian people don't want to do because it's very hard work and it's very bad payment, to a point that they want to absorb immigration to fill this vacancy of being teacher. So that is why I choose to study a master's degree of education and eventually actually become a teacher in primary school for about 2 years.
Then how did you jump to the world of art?
Well, it's a long game, right? After I eventually have my permanent visa, then I begin to have my life of my own, and I can pursuing my dream to be artist. And that's when I starting to doodling about China's politics and the human rights, and gradually post it online. And then basically this is how the story of Badiucao unfolded.
But in terms of societal expectation, you're a failure to some extent to your parents, is it?
Yeah, for sure. I think this is very idea from the Chinese culture that the best children are the most obeying children. So if I choose differently from the path that's set by my parents, then I've already kind of betrayed my family. And economically, being an artist is probably the dumbest choice that you can make, as many artists sitting there understand. But also, on top of being an artist, which is kind of economically irresponsible, then you do political art. It just makes things worse. For my family, the reason why they would support me to move from China to Australia is because they want me to unplug myself from China, unplug myself from all this chaotic political risk. But I guess what I did is completely opposite. So yes, I can totally see how disappointing my parents will be for my choices.
Yeah, that the outlook towards creative arts, even within Tibetan community, traditionally is not that great. For example, when I was in school, for example, student who failed in 8th grade or 10th grade was sent to either to be a painter or a performing artist at the Tibetan Institute of Performing Arts. So, which means if you are bright, you have to go to college, graduate, get a degree, get a government job or something like that. So, and I am a writer. If I write a book, let's say of 200 pages, at least I have some leverage that the reader might like the first section, or some reader might like the second section, or others might like the last page. But when you create a work of art, such as at the back, you have only one chance. Mm-hmm. Only one chance. So can you walk us through the process of, choosing a subject matter, and then walk us through the very idea that you have in your mind to the final physical artwork?
I think you mentioned about this one chance, but it's actually not one chance because for me, I read news on a daily basis. I mean, almost like Trump, addicted to his tweet. It's same for me. And that's how I connected with the world or the people inside of China to learning them from those windows on social media. Then I try to work as fast as I can for my political cartooning because, the real life of political cartooning is how close it follows the news, but not too close. Because in order to make a successful cartoon, political cartoon, for the time-wise, it needs to happen after the world is knowing about the story, but not so late that they've already forgot about it and choose another one. So it's a very critical time frame that I need to finish a cartoon in the peak of the attention. Thus, it maximizes this power of my visual opinion presented in this visual language. But for cartooning, I think there is actually a formula that everyone can adapt behind it, especially in these days that other people can just use AI to generate memes or images. Really, cartooning is this simple idea that you can summarize it as a sentence. And then when you apply this sentence as a promote to AI, I believe everybody can be a cartoonist. And for me, the very essence of good political cartooning is how you combining a political message into a visual representation, which is almost a cliche visual representation, whether it's from a famous film's poster or a children's fairy tale book or an online meme that exists in Reddit. But it's about to create this very familiar image for your audiences, and in the same time, you twisted it a little bit. So when people looking into it, they think it is something, then they realize it's something else. I always think a great cartoon is when you create this delusion. It's a very soft silk velvet pillow, but inside of it there's a needle. So when people looking into it, a pad is sitting on it, they feel the sting. And this sting is where the satire or where the ironic part existing.
Yeah, recently I wrote an eight-line satire poem. And the process almost seems similar because you have to get the fact right before you make a comment on something. So I have to absolutely get the fact right. Then you create a story, and then you can have the punchline as the satire. So maybe that's exactly almost as you do, right? And the other thing that I wanted to ask about is because your political artworks are commentary on not only about the situation in China, but about Tibet, Hong Kong, Ukraine, Palestine, and even the United States.
Yeah.
So how do you choose a subject matter, and how much research goes into each piece that you create?
I mean, you mentioned about my work about America. I confess, for the past several months, almost a year, that I've done more cartoon on Trump than Xi Jinping. And that's how absurd the word has turned into, unfortunately. But for me, as a political cartoonist or as an artist, my core value would always be seeing human rights as universal. Personally, I really don't like being called as dissident. And that is because the very essence, meaning behind dissident is about you against something. But I believe we're not about against just CCP, but about upholding human rights as universal value. And if we believe that, then it means this value or standard must be applied to different regimes, regardless if it's China or America or Australia, the country that I live in now. And only for keeping the same value applied equally, then we have protected the integrity of being an independent artist. But of course, a choose of topic is another big thing. I do divide my practice into two parts. So one would be political cartooning, and it's really just news tendency chasing. So whatever is the hottest topic, that from my observation on social media or mainstream media, I would try to attacking that. But also for me, I think it's very important. This news is not just about some, entertaining stars got an affair. It must have a very clear social implication, and only for that I will be interested to reflect. But then the second part of it is more like for my gallery practice. Sometimes I don't see my political cartoon as a finished work. It's rather, I would call it a visual diary that I've been keeping. It's a very fast response. It's very raw. And even though it might got viral online swiftly, but the issue is it's still quite shallow thinking, whether it's representation visually or the meaning behind it. So very often I would go back to the collection of my daily political cartoon and see whether which piece of news deserves more research, or whether there's a potential for an image to be developed into oil painting, installation, or even performance.
Yeah, you spoke a little bit about the connection between art and resistance just now, but I wanted to ask even more. Sometimes when we look at a political artwork, it almost appears on first glimpse. It's like pointing middle finger at Xi Jinping or CCP or the people in power. But I'm sure there are more nuanced link between what you are commenting and what you are aspiring for. So can you walk us through how you create such a work, and also how an audience should react to something that you create?
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy to just showing rage against certain things. And, there are lazy artists in this world, and you'll see a lot of cartooning are just, kind of exaggerated size of head and small limbs and doing some funny gesture. Then it requires a speech bubble to explain what's really going on. And for me, I believe that a good cartooning would be a pure visual expression. And also because I want to communicate not just to the people inside of China, but also outside of China. Or if I'm commentating on Americans' politics, I don't want it to have text in English so that the Chinese people will understand. So, but visual language is such a universal thing that it's allowing people to overcome the language barrier much easier. But for the real creation process of it, I always try to avoiding being too sensational. You can do a middle finger, a curse, make someone like pigs. For example, recently, Donald Trump shared a TikTok video that featuring Obama couple as monkeys. And an instant reaction with cartooning would be you draw Trump as a pig or something like that. But for me, I would deliberately try to avoiding that, because once you do that, you lower yourself to the same level like Trump. And thus you actually losing the ground to criticize such behavior. So by attacking these topics, that it's very essential to me to not just, being tempted into a cheap curse, but try to find a more funny and interesting or subtle angle to describe it.
So coming closer to the Tibetan community, you created several artwork commenting on situation inside Tibet, including one there about Tashi Wangchu, the Tibetan language advocate. So what was your first awareness about Tibet and its people, and how do you see it now?
In my university time, I have a very good friend who's from Qinghai province in China. And for that time, I don't have a concept of Great Tibet. I know the Tibet province, I know Qinghai province, I know Gansu province, but I didn't realize it all belonged to the same Asian kingdom as your community. But when I went to there in Qinghai, I visited a temple, Tar Si. Then I realized these are the similar culture pattern and legacy and language as the people in so-called Xizang province. So how come, It's sharing the similar or the same culture, but it's divided into pieces. I guess this is my beginning point of questioning about what is really going on the political circumstance around the Tibetan community. But of course, inside of China is really a black information hole that it's very hard to truly understand what is going on. It is almost impossible to learning what's happening for Han Chinese words. Then you can imagine the censorship and the propaganda will be much larger against Tibetans and the Uyghurs and South Mongolians. I think I only starting to knowing more after I left China, and especially when the Tibetan self-immolation began. That really hitting the international news from the very beginning. And for me, just as a human being, to seeing such sacrifice and sympathize like myself as a condition of the Tibetan people to realize to what extent of the pain that the people were willingly to do this ultimate sacrifice. And there must be more that is hidden and untold by the Chinese government. Thus, this is happening. So that movement does making me trying to learn more about what is going on in Tibet. And for me, I think one thing is very important that making me feel confident and a necessity to support Tibetan community is I do not have this complex of big nationalism. From my understanding, I think state is a tool instead of purpose. State should be a tool to achieving individual well-being instead of the other way around. And if being a part of China doesn't mean happiness for the Tibetans, why do we have to do that? If being part of China or being a Chinese doesn't mean my life will be better, why do I really pro-Chinese nationalism? But unfortunately, I think the majority people, particularly Han people in China, is so polluted by the idea of ultranationalism, and that making them to be blind and or unwilling to knowing more about the pain that happening or their own crime that has been committed to Tibetan people or Uyghurs that we've witnessing now after the forced labor concentration camp being established. And some people might argue, nationalism is a sense of pride, it is okay. But I think in the term of the Chinese nationalism, it has nothing to do with pride. It's this sense of insecurity. Instead of pride, it's arrogance. And also lack of self-esteem. They feel like they're victims all the time because what happened in 150 years ago in the Qing dynasty. So the humiliation, the history must be reversed. Thus, the past is not really trying to prevent the tragedy of other victims happening, but they become persecuted itself. And that's not real pride. That's just pathetic.
And the other question that I wanted to ask is, for any movement, symbols are really important. Representations, where people can unite together, create solidarity. And in the case of Tibet, we have the Snow flag, the Tibetan national flag, which is banned inside Tibet. But how do you see the possibility for young artists to create something from Tibetan culture or artistic world?
For me, I'm really grateful that your community allowing me to borrow those symbols into art. I cannot say that I know enough to be able to use those symbols. And to some extent, as an outsider, I'm still just brushing the very surface of it. And I have self-awareness of borrowing those very beautiful elements as an outsider or former colonizer, if you want to put it that way. But I think it is Tibetan people's own aesthetics and culture that give you the confidence to truly develop it and use it, or even break it if that will generate more sparks. I think for tradition art, there's a lot of inspiration, but it's also necessary to be a cage to stop the further development of it. To be an artist really mean to be free from repression, but also kind of free from the stereotype of history as well.
Yeah, continuing the topic of art, there's a famous maxim, art for art's sake, which, at least to me, I think it's a luxury that only few can afford. For people such as you and I and others who are being colonized and oppressed. I think art has to mean something else.
Yeah.
Then we also have the gatekeepers, the art galleries, the art critics, the art curators who define by and large what is so-called good art, what is not good art, and who to give space to and who to deny.
Yeah.
And one of the things that they constantly say is that your art has too much politics in it.
Oh yeah.
And so how was your experience with the galleries and the art world generally?
Maybe instead of saying that my art is too much politics, they can just say my politics is too much art. I always think there's misunderstanding of this very phrase, art for the sake of art. In order to understand it, it cannot be taken out from its historic context. When artists are chanting art for the sake of art, it is actually a political movement to say no to the national propaganda, right? It's a rejection to be hijacked by national or ideology narrative. But it does not mean I do not have a political agenda within art. I'm using non-political subject to reject ideology hijaction. Itself is already political. I believe there's no way that you can really saying I'm creating a pure art form with no political elements. If we really examine the essence of politics, it is power dynamic between people in a micro level in a daily life. How your parents treating you, how you treat your girlfriend, how your teacher treating you, how you struggle with this power dynamic. These are all life experience as well as politics. So how can you say an art is not political or not enough political or too much political? I would certainly against this very notion. And secondly, I would argue from my personal experience. As a kid growing up in such family history in China, then myself become a target of the Chinese regime for the transnational repression. If I want to be an artist and be truthful about my life, that is my first-hand experience. If I do not talk about those topics, I would be hypocritical. I would be talking about something that I'm not familiar with. Thus, how can you say that art is more authentic than my political art? So really, if you grow up in an environment which has, just cotton candy and ice cream, maybe you do art about cotton candy and ice cream. But I grow up not with so much luck. But still, I think I compare with Tibetan people, I'm much more privileged. But yeah, I feel obligated to be truthful to my life. Thus, it has to be political.
Yeah, and also your experience with the galleries, how did that go?
I think I want to come back to this thing that you mentioned about the gatekeepers, right? The curators or the directors. They tend to play a safe game, and they're not really art avant-garde or defender. They are more like agency for rock stars in the entertaining business, from my understanding of contemporary art scene. And for example, in Australia, the difficulty that I face are coming from both public institutions and commercial galleries. So for the commercial galleries, the reality is in Western countries, right? I will always be seen as some kind of Asian or Chinese artist. And there are galleries will be divided into different camps. And usually, the one who will be interested in my art would be the one who deal with Asia art. But the issue is those galleries usually have business tied with China. So adapting me or, representing me, meaning basically saying no to their Chinese market. And because of that I feel tremendous difficulty to have this opportunity to be represented by a commercial gallery in Australia. Then for the public institutions, yes, it seems like it's not relying on any commercial ties, but in fact, a lot of them are still receiving fundings or donation from entrepreneurs locally in Australia. And particularly in Australia, this might be a little bit unique case because Australia's economy is so relying on China, especially for exporting the mining resources. I guess who is the biggest art institution donor? It's a mining company. And because of that they would always be very cautious to collaborate with artists like me, because otherwise it will jeopardize the donor's business with China. But also, I have more observation in the depths of those public institutions, particularly in Australia. Well, we need to understand first that Australia has a very dark and genocidal history against indigenous community. Thus, for the liberals or artistic people or the cultural people, that we tend to be more progressive and never want to be labeled as racist. That's where the Chinese government is hijacking this justified cause and make it something else. So I will be called as anti-China all the time by the Chinese government. They're calling me, xenophobia. I tell you this one little incident happening during my Warsaw exhibition several years ago. The Chinese embassy sent some stuff to the museum and demanding the show to be canceled in person. And after they failed the mission, when the show goes on, they issue a statement on their website in English. And they're calling me anti-China Australian artist. They erased my identity as I'm China-born. By just reading the sentence, you would imagine I'm some kind of, KKK, Nazi, white supremacist Australian artist, but actually I am a China-born. So that's how they play the game. And unfortunately, this kind of racist accusation game played very well into the weakness of the so-called progressiveness and the liberal art people in Australia. So they don't want to be called as anti-China. Thus, the most safe way is do not really work with me at all.
Yeah, the term that you use, lived experience, I think it's fundamentally important for people such as Tibetans, that the situation that we are facing now undergoing. It also reminds me of something that happened some 20 years ago. In 2004, I did an anthology of Tibetan poetry covering 30 years from 1930, covering about 50 years or so. But eventually, when we distributed the book to many scholars and critics, one of the Indian scholars said, "Politics do not make good writing." And that, at the time, at least, I didn't really understand fundamentally what it meant. But I think, looking back now, I think it makes perfect sense for us to tell our stories in a way that we experience. Because, earlier you were talking about, art for art's sake as something that is that doesn't really apply to people such as us. So I think for any aspiring artist, I think it's really important for the lived experience to be used in the creative expression. I think that is really important. And the other thing that I wanted to ask you about, since you already mentioned, freedom and censorship, you worked as an assistant for Ai Weiwei for a while, did you? Right?
Yes.
Recently Ai Weiwei had an exhibition in Delhi, and he also made a comment, in which he basically said that the censorship and the repression in Western country is as worse, if not worse than in China. And furthermore, he said that the Western countries have no moral authority to lecture China on human rights issues. So since you lived in China part of your life, and you also lived now in Australia, I wonder how you make sense of this, Ai Weiwei's comments.
Right. Well, I still respect him, almost like, a senior from family. And I think he's a towering figure for the Chinese contemporary, especially advocating for human rights for many, many years. But I cannot say that I'm completely agree with his recent comment, especially compare the Western censorship with China. I think the fact might be right. Is there is censorship very clearly and blunt censorship in China. And in Western society, there is censorship. And it could be quite problematic as well. But the issue is compare those in the same time. I would have zero issue if there's criticism against them individually. By putting them together, that's where the problem begins. That's where whataboutism is replacing the legitimate criticism. As if you're saying, this is the bad guy, this is the bad guy, so, everyone is bad guy, and it's okay. You're legitimize both censorship in that way. In China, there's a saying, all the crows are black, 天下乌鸦一般黑. And that's a sentence using for a person try to escape from the responsibility to actually challenge the whole world. When you say that, you've already surrounded your integrity and saying, think everyone is black. Why do I bother to be white? So I think it's very important that avoiding such comparison, it's okay to criticize Western, and it's necessary because that's the way to protect democracy. But do not compare with China. And another very important thing is we have to in this world, I believe we have to separate the value or the principle of those human rights from existing establishment of any political government, state, or regime. Particularly by saying this, I mean America. Yes, it's a very devastating time to see how a most powerful democracy is degenerating into this orange turd. It is devastating to see the truth from the Epstein file, to see how corrupted and perverted and vogue for those very elite from the Western society. It is very pain to see the inaction when the bombing in Gaza is happening. It is very pain to see what's happening in Iran at this moment, and it's slightly more complicated. But it does not mean the value of human rights or freedom of speech or democracy invalid because those country or states invent them in the history. That we have to separate the value and believe in the value or this very idea itself. And only to achieving that, then this fight is still working. Otherwise, it's just this annihilism, like nothing is good, everything is fake. And that's not helpful.
Yeah, you're very right. And I think, by the way, Ai Weiwei was not only one who made sweeping statement, which compares, Western democracy, however bad, however defective it is, to one-party dictatorship. I think, for example, in places such as Tibet, as many as 100 Tibetan writers and intellectuals are being jailed. Some as many as 10 years for writing a book. We, as you said very well, in the Western democratic countries, however much censorship happens, how much repression happens, but at least there's existing civil society. People can talk about things. People can have discussion such as one we're having here. And just a few days ago, I saw a clip where young activists in a conference room were shouting at Trump's face. Now, such things do not happen and can never happen in place like China. So I think the comparison, sometimes the sweeping statement, China and Western countries are almost the same in terms of human rights and basic. So I think that is problematic. So with this, I think I would like to open it for questions. We have nice young bunch of audience.
So my question, I actually have like two questions. So the first question is, like, you've mentioned that your parents taught you that pursuing the path of art would be dangerous. So at the same time, we can actually consider art something dangerous but powerful. Mm-hmm. So with you creating all your political arts, and you've also mentioned that the CCP is insecure. So do you feel like your art has shown its power? And my second question is that I'm also actually from Tibet. I've studied in Chengdu for a while, and I'm actually from Qinghai, where the place you mentioned. And the thing is, you've mentioned that your political arts needs a time frame, needs to be with the news, the hot news. So back when I was in China, when I was in school, I used to sideways tell my Chinese friends that, you know what, the Chinese actually invaded my hometown, instead of the propaganda you've mentioned. But they were so shocked. They were like, what do you mean? Wasn't we were there to liberate you guys? So you can see that the propaganda and the history has been really erased. The actual fact of the Tibetan history has been erased by the CCP, and this is actually an old news, which is a fact, but it's something that happened in the 1950s, 60s. So do you feel like your art, your political art, can still try to express or try to show others that fact of the history?
Yeah. I might need you to remind me the first question a little bit.
Do you feel like you're holding the power?
Okay, yeah. I think this is actually the very essence of any artist or any art. That authoritarian regime inherently afraid of art because they know art is so powerful. And their attitude towards art is, if I cannot control them as propaganda, I'd rather destroy it. That is actually showing that they acknowledge the power of art, and they're afraid when it's out of control. But art is about out of control. Art is about break the taboo. Art is about not tolerate a red line, regardless I want to cross it or not. So yes, I think fundamentally, philosophically, that is just contradictory value against any authoritarian regime. But in reality, I think I would use Winnie the Pooh as an example to illustrate it can be very powerful. I mean, I'm not the artist who really invented this meme. It is just a meme merged online. But I do think I might have a little bit contribution for Winnie the Pooh to become an international meme with my platform. And certainly that comparison making Xi Jinping so annoyed. And it become a seed that growing up a lot of more, aggressive and interesting things to a point that it adapted by South Park, the very, popular satire animation in America. So now it's no longer just a mean underground. It become mainstream entertaining satire. Imagine how bad that will, gut punch the Chinese propaganda. So yes, I do think art is powerful, especially engage with the logic of how we anti-censorship and, using the power of social media to create more ripple around influence. And okay, you need to remind me the second question.
Do you feel like you can make political arts to rewrite the propaganda that's an old news?
Absolutely. I mean, for political art, cartoon, it does require you to writing the tie. But for historic events, it is also can be seen as some kind of iconic. For example, the Tiananmen massacre, the very icon of Tank Man, is something the Chinese government tried to erase with all its might and power, to a point that I think it even purchased the copyright of some image from a picture database so that you cannot legally use it. But when those images, historic images the Chinese government tried to erase, and when as artists to combine those historic image with most latest image, then it just creates a unexpected effect that both highlighting the tragedy in the history, but also showing this tragedy is continuing in the contemporary time. And in fact, because of censorship, that a lot of facts will be covered, a lot of image will be censored, and art become the only solution to recreate the scene. I think visual is very powerful in a way, not just for art, but also for general attention keeper. A lot of people argue that it seems like the entire world is really devoted into the pro-Palestinian movement and questioning about, there's atrocity in Sudan, there's atrocity in Iran, there's atrocity in Tibet, in East Turkestan. How come there's no equal voices? My analyzation is if we compare Palestinian people with Uyghurs, they're both Muslims, both being experiencing genocide. But how come one cause receive much more support compared with the other ones? Take away from those stupid tanky, anti-imperialists. I'm talking about general people. Why they have strong emotional response to the Palestinian people is because the visual has been preserved and circulating on social media. We're literally seeing those clips of baby crying and dying from Gaza. But what Chinese government did so well is it almost eliminated all images of concentration camp in East Turkestan. That simply, you just have this very chill numbers that ordinary people do not responding to cold numbers. I mean, some number can be so devastating if you're really looking into, I was reading during the time of this policy being introduced, there's a rocket rising of all-day childcare in East Turkestan. Why? Because the parents are all being sending to the concentration camp, and those kids will have to be sending to the all-day care or like a boarding school. But yes, it takes a lot of time to digesting and reading into it, and it's not sensational. And that's exactly, I believe, art can fill the vacuum of the missing of visual or audio or sensory experience, that generating the same thing when the actual record is missing. And that is applied to the history that has been erased, as well as what is being going on contemporary, and it's not the revealing itself.
Well, the audience can think. Let me ask the follow-up question. Since you mentioned Tang Man, you have Tang Man tattooed on your shoulder.
Yeah.
Can we see it?
Sure. Well, it's a bit hard, actually. Let me turn it off if I can. There we go.
So that's the Tang Man. The question that I wanted to ask is, we always talk about collective strength.
Mm-hmm.
But, Tang Man is such an unknown figure. We even don't know who he really was.
Mm-hmm.
But despite that fact, he has become now an enduring significance and symbol of Tiananmen Square massacre and student democracy movement. So how, can each individual, especially artists, do for the struggle, in terms of what they can do and create?
Sometimes I question myself because I've been repeating this very image a lot of time in different occasions. as an artist, can be a little bit boring, actually, if I be really honest. But it's also about how do I injecting new meaning to this very image. And it's a global icon. It is inspiration to not just to the people in China, but around the world. Before the Soviet Union's falling, then this image is inspirational for countries like Czech Republic, for Poland as well, I believe. So, historically, it is celebrated as a universal symbol. And it would be so sad to see it just, disappeared. So even though it can be a little bit boring to revisit it again and again, but isn't it our job as an artist to creating new experience, even if we have to deal with the old material?
Nice to meet you over here again, and my name is Kunsang. So I do this project called Stories of Tibetans, and I have been doing this for the past 7 years. So my question is, how important is the story behind your art?
I think art is very relying on narrative and story. Recently, I've been trying a different form of expression, which is actually graphic novel. I published my first graphic novel last year in the United States, and its name is called You Must Take Part in Revolution. It is actually a quote from Mao, but me and my co-author Melissa Chen deliberately using it to kind of subversively deconstruct the meaning of this very sentence. And this is my first time to trying comic or graphic novel as a form. It is no longer just relying a one frame expression, but a linear story that it's not just about one moment of appreciation, but also introducing time as a material in the storytelling. And I think we as human beings from the very beginning, in order to preserve memory, a story plays such an important role. And whoever is the best storyteller probably would have the power as material power, as politicians, and sometimes great religion also tell great stories like Buddhism. So story is very essential, and even ideology is a competing between storytelling. You have the American dream, you have the China dream, and they're all narrative or story competing. And what artists can do is definitely take advantage of story. That is something that echoing with our Asian memory. And it's definitely powerful.
Your talk at the TBI was kind of better than a political scientist. So following that, can you please tell a bit about what do you see that China's that kind of change or development in the next maybe till 30 years?
30 years. You are very positive about if the world still has 30
that
years.
long.
I think nowadays you cannot really talk about a country individually, that we have to see it globally. And my reading of China, or more in the global sense, is quite dark at this moment. That I think China is inevitably going to invade Taiwan, one way or another, and it will leading to two results, which is equally very dark. So the first one is the World War. We've already seen war start burning from the Ukraine to Palestine to Iran now, and almost you can see the fire spreading down to east to Asia, eventually the Asia Pacific. And that would be, China invading Taiwan, and may or may not drag American into it, and that will be the beginning of the real World War. And it could be a nuclear war. So maybe we don't have 30 years, and the entire Earth will be evaporated. That is a very true possibility. We laugh about it, but it could be true. And the second option is also no better than that one. there has been this theory called hemisphere influence, that is basically seeing how America's democracy is declining to a point it actually will become an autocracy, and it's no longer upholding values of democracy, but only talking about the power and the values. So imagine a world almost like 1984, that you have America occupying the North America and South America. And Americans are already doing that by saying, Canada need to be the 51 state, claiming they have the ownership or want to purchase or invade the Greenland to the Panama Canal. And recently, to do this arrest of Maduro from Venezuela. Well, for that, it's actually good, but it's good to see a dictator being finished. But how much does it really help in the country of Venezuela now? It's a big question, because the same regime just elected another puppet, and that, as if it's showing that Americans do not really care about democracy spreading anymore. It want to be its own kingdom. And it might negotiate with Russia and China, saying, okay, Russia, you can just keep marching in Europe. Eventually, you can get what you want. And for Taiwan and China, you can keep this little half of hemisphere. Then eventually it become 3 authoritarian regime ruling the earth together. So that is really dark for both options. And for me, the only solution that I think can counter those super economic and military power is really the unity through meeting middle power countries. Firstly, Europe, then maybe India, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and Taiwan. But you know how hard international collaboration can be, especially with this vast distance between those countries and different cultures and everything. That requires a lot. But maybe that is a solution if we can really pull it through. But I don't know. If you ask me, I'm really scared about the future.
Wonderful talk, by the way. I just want to... I have 2 questions. One is, you mentioned about you coming from an artistic family, and you lost your grandpa and his brother in that field, in that process, right? So not only that, you have faced harassment, transnational repression, you have been followed. So my question is, why do you still choose to become this political cartoonist? And my second question is, I forgot the second question. You can first answer the first question.
Thank you. That's actually good. Otherwise, I'll be end up asking you what's the first question. I mean, if you come from a experience of making art, you know how addictive it is, right? I any other day, I really just want to be an artist, and the passion to be an artist and making arts, I think, overcome any other barrier for me at this moment. I think the real challenge is if we see beyond the lens of art and see it as activism, then it seems like the activism doesn't really work for a long time. And it's not about questioning if what I'm doing is right. It's the questioning about if I'm doing is actually useful or working. I think that would be the challenge than just, giving up and find personal safety. But I do believe that, within the action itself, there is power. Thus, regardless of the outcome, if, China can be changed in 10 years, 30 years, 50 years, it doesn't matter as long as I believe what I'm doing is right, what I create is beautiful, and that's enough for me.
And my second question is, China is getting stronger day by day, right? In terms of military, in terms of financially. So what gives you hope in confronting this so powerful authoritarian regime? What gives you hope?
Aliens? Now, I I don't particularly rely on hope. Like I answered for the first question, I rely on the beauty or the heroism of the action itself. So I don't need hope to continue. I just need to make good art to satisfy myself to continue, and that's it.
We can take 2 more questions then.
Hi, my name is Tenzin Lissa, and I'm currently co-leading VTech, Volunteer Tibet Advocacy with Dharamshala, and I'm 18 years old. So my question is that how important is it like for the young people to be active in this cause? Not only that, like whatever the Chinese propaganda is, like Chinese Communist Party is doing to push their propaganda ahead. How important our youth and young people is it, like, to be active in this cause and this issue?
I think it's very, very important because the traditional media is dying, right? The legacy media is losing its followers day by day. Everyone just consuming short videos with the newer social media. That's where your expertise is. Compared with me, a 40-year-old, silly artist, you'll be much better on those way of editing and representing. I do think in this world, perhaps the younger generation are having much more power than the older generation when they were young. And yeah, it's completely important for more young people to join into the political campaign as early as possible, because you must believing that your understanding and power is no less than any, elder or adults. I mean, for example, Greta Thunberg, the climate girl, I think her politics is a bit weird now, but before that, I do believe that he is a great role model to showing that how a teenage can actually change the world and accumulating a lot of influence. But I guess the real challenge is when you're actually having all those power, eventually, the big question is how do you wield it? How do you make sure you use your power on the right course?
We take 1 more question.
Thank you so much for your insight on your creative process. So nothing critical question, just simple question. So do you know or do you follow any Tibetan contemporary artists? If so, any reasons you like their artworks or anything?
I have to say that I'm that kind of artist. Don't go to exhibition at all. So I don't think I know any good if you ask me who's my favorite contemporary art in the world, I would say I don't know. So unfortunately, but yesterday when I had a show and with this very young Tibetan cartoonist, Gatekeepers, I think his work is fantastic and everybody should checking it.
One last question I answer.
Yeah, you mentioned about the self-censorship as well as transnational repression. So my question is regarding, so self-censorship is more sort of internal. So transnational repression is more sort of external. So what do you think which is more important to challenge?
I think, of course, self-censorship is more dangerous because for international repression, that you can lobbying with the local government in the country where you stay, you can seeking help from politicians or activists locally, try to counter it. There is a lot of, when it's external threat, there's also many external support to deal with the situation. But self-censorship is a lonely fight that you can only do it by yourself. And that is much harder. And once it's embedded in your mind, it's also very hard to unplug. So I do think in order to be able to without the ability to counter self-censorship, it's meaningless to stop transnational repression. That's really the foundation for everything.
Yeah, so I will ask one more question. This will be the last, I'm
sure.
For sure. You must be tired by now. So
no, I enjoy it. I really enjoy it.
So without any formal training in art, you have done so well so far. For young Tibetan artists, not only young Tibetan artists, but for any young artist, growing up and aspiring to be artist, what would you say, given the circumstances that the world is with the humongous geopolitical taking place and the climate crisis, given all of these circumstances, what would you say to aspiring young artists?
I think it's really not necessary to be a good artist via going to art school or academic training. In my opinion, it would be better if you go learn philosophy or social science or physics. Art is a form of expression for something you can express. But art school usually do not really necessarily training you thoughts, but for skills. So yeah, I don't think it requires talent or particular skill to be an artist anymore. There are so many tools can be used. The most important things are the ideas and the way that you can reflect your experience. That actually really opening the window to more people to join the family of being an artist. And also don't see artists as this sacred or some very great position. It's just a hobby. It is just an identity that everybody can take. As for the political side, again, we need to learn to appreciate the beauty of the action itself, not the result. Yes, the world is desperate. I've just mentioned two very likely end of the world, but it doesn't matter. What matter is now. What matter is we created that is satisfying our desire to appreciate the beauty.
Yeah, with this, we have come to the end of this conversation. As Badiucao has rightly said, narrative is fundamentally important. Any community who tells a better story has a better chance of survival, not only survival, but also possibility to thrive and sustain in the long run. The fact that Tibetan community has survived so long despite humongous oppression inside Tibet and also the numerous challenges that we have faced in exile. The fact that we have survived is because we managed to tell our story based on how we lived. I think that is fundamentally the lesson that we are going to take home. And that I think is really important. I always say that he who tells better story will survive in the long run, and he who takes care of his narrative today will have a better future tomorrow and will have a better past as well. So with this, I want to thank you, Badiucao. Once again, thank you very much indeed for taking part in this wonderful conversation, and we hope that we will meet again and have such conversation in the future as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
남양 유로에미 누리에미 나좀 둔조수티 장딩 독지 대팍도 독거 사티드 나티 산질마 파쇼커 흉뱀이 빈인답도게 차다르딘 즈마 포기가는미 공장무 신신 주멜라 다시 코멜라 딘디 제마 타도 때차테 불라 토르티 공리 카와 휴티 젠도 군기 타와라 핀 공리 밀라노 인인 공리 비테나 소티 코티 파게 비조르 나 코티 더도티 니 재미라야 타모 살로티 탈라마초도 찰라마요 Shivarewa, Deva Gewa, Tomomi Yarki, the Zaro Jat Yewa, Nini take a trip so ye not take at the woo.